some of the research that we've seen tends to lead to big transfers of what came into the system as total phosphorus or sediment-bound phosphorus, and then conversion into soluble phosphorus. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how, like the wetlaculture idea that you're proposing, how those things would look at that, because it looks like your studies aren't going back to the wet cycle afterwards.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about the aerobic anaerobic switch, but the phosphorus that we capture in the wetland, going down 30, 60 centimeters, and it will be there. That's what we're recycling to the corn or sugar or whatever agricultural crop we use. So the whole idea is to try to get most of what the wetland captured. It won't all be bioavailable immediately, but it will be eventually. We want to be able to capture most of that into the food production, and then when that's depleted, you throw the switch, make it a wetland again, and start the wetland accumulating nutrients. So the wetland accumulates the nutrients and the agriculture uses it. But the important point is we're not adding fertilizer. So when we run our 10-year experiment, we're not going to ever fertilize any of those 28 tubs. Or maybe we'll fertilize a few of them to see if it makes any difference.
So it's much more of, not as much of the 10 to 5-year cycling as it is adaptive based on, when do those sediment rates deplete to kind of background or something like that?
Yeah, and of course, it depends on whether it's soluble phosphorus or particulate phosphorus. We're seeing a lot of soluble phosphorus, of course. And that stays in the soil column as opposed to a sheen of sediments on the top. But it'll be both. Well, that's why we're doing a 10-year experiment. We're going to be probing all these questions and seeing if we are able, the whole point was to see if we could capture nutrients, and obviously we're doing that, and then recycle it back to society, which would be the agriculture. And it happened, instead of digging it up, throwing it in a truck, putting it some other place, we're basically flipping the land right there. I think it'll work.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Ann Redmond, Brown and Caldwell from Orlando, Florida. Actually, my question is kind of a follow-on to that one. We're looking at working with landowners north of Lake Okeechobee in that watershed, and have been looking at doing large-scale wetland restoration approach. One of the issues is the legacy phosphorus in those soils. So whatever treatment approach you take, you have to also treat what's already there. So it's kind of like what you're talking about already. Yeah. But the thing that when you don't keep the wetland treatment system constantly inundated, you export phosphorus from the system unless you can retain it in the site using that new water farming approach that people are talking about. Right. So I guess my question has to do with the practicality of the farmers. Is what we're paying them for is to build the levees to hold the water on their property during the wetland treatment phase, and then the subsequent ag phase where the agricultural plants are taking up the nutrients to prevent them from exporting to the system. Yeah. So you're building a levee and water control system to keep everything in.
My view, if I had a chalkboard like a good professor should, I could show you that we're taking nutrients down when it's a wetland, and then we're taking nutrient concentrations are going up, and then when we take the plants, it's going to go down. Partially because the agricultural crops are taken out, but partially because it's being exported. But at the end of a 2-year cycle, we will be better off than we were 2 years before. So over a 10-year cycle, you would see a noticeable decrease in the legacy.
But you're preventing runoff
yes.
of the system. I think that's really the crux of my question. Yes. You're preventing runoff during that
it'll be
uptake
dynamic
period.
It will be more flow through when it's agriculture, actually. And you would be plugging the towel drainage, if I can say it that way.
I'd like to dig in more of this, but later.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Christina with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and I'm the manager for the Maumee Designated State Scenic River. So I watch the Maumee and Sandusky watersheds very closely, and one of the drivers that has led and contributed heavily to more phosphorus runoff in these watersheds are changing rainfall events. So with the concept of these mesocosm experiments and being able to process phosphorus from these flowing water systems, at what rate are you pushing this nutrient-rich water through the mesocosms? Because we've been experiencing heavy rainfall events that can drop 3 inches of rain in an hour.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what that realistic feasibility is of how much processing can be done if these wetlands have a fire hose of water coming to them.
Yeah. No, the flow-through is dominated by the flow-through. So our loading rates, what was it, 10 centimeters? 10 centimeters per week. We have two, but that's part of the experiment. We have 2 different loading rates we're doing, but they overwhelm rainfall as far as volume of water. Now, yes, when you have a downpour for that one day, you've got a lot of water. But just like the wetlands we had at Ohio State, the rainfall was not as significant as the flow-through. And so we are running an experiment to see if low flow or high flow works. We're seeing if deep water or shallow water works as well. So that's my graduate student's experiment, because we don't, if we flipped plants and she had to do it, she'd be a graduate student for 6 years. So she'll do the wetland stuff, and then the next student will come along and do the corn.
Okay, thank you.
Will Hemker with the University of Akron Research Foundation, and I'm not a biologist, I'm not a wetlands person, but I'm here to learn. And we heard this morning that harmful algal blooms are not just an Ohio event or a Lake Erie, Ohio event, it's a global event.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an issue dealing with, I think what we all can agree on is called non-point source pollution. All right? So non-points coming from every locale, rural, urban, suburban. What makes a point source, such as a wetland and an artificial wetland, the answer for non-point source pollution?
What makes a point?
What makes a point source remediation approach as wetlands, as your microcosm wetlands, a solution for non-point source
Well, the
pollution?
microcosm is a test tube for a big landscape. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of acres, one contiguous wetland. We won't know what will work and when to flip and so on unless we run these mesocosm studies and see how that particular soil, it's so soil dependent, but the soil where you're running where you're going to eventually build your wetland, to see the temporal scale.
Well, let's go to the previous question that came up here with the rain events. What size does your wetlands have to be in the Black Swamp area? 1.5 million acres, whatever you want to talk about that area, that watershed.
Well, it's not going to be
You're
one.
saying 10%.
It's going to be 10%.
You're confident that 10% can cover these issues that we have in rainfall?
It's going to be 10% of the, approximately, we'll need 10% of the former Great Black Swamp.
So at $4,000 an acre, you're talking $500 million to put in 10% of wetlands in.
Isn't that what I just said? We need $1 billion. Half of it goes to the farmer.
That,
You're right on.
are you familiar with the work that Iowa State's been doing since about 2005 on
Yes,
C4 warm season prairie grasses?
I know what Iowa State's been doing. I
Yeah,
understand.
they've got a process they call strips,
But I also
scientific
understand a lot of-
testing for prairies, and they found that a 30-foot strip, about 3% of a farmer's production field taken out at the downward slope, the lowland area of that field, can capture 85 to 90% of the phosphorus.
On the surface, but in the meantime, 89% of it's going under this.
No, sir. They're catching it all. And the surface is the hardest. Soluble reactive phosphorus is the most difficult. So, I mean, we're looking for solutions here on a system approach. That's what the ecology is telling us. HABs is a cause of system imbalance. Shouldn't we be looking at a whole portfolio of biological
We're
tools?
looking at things that you can put on the landscape that will be sustainable, that you don't have to mow, you don't have to do.
One last economic point. Prairies cost less than $500 an acre, $500 an acre to put in.
I thought you said you didn't know any of this stuff.
Let's look at the economic model. You brought up business model, let's
We will
talk
have an
about
economic
economics.
model for you in a minute.